In this video, I'm going to be introducing Google Colab and describing some of its interface. Now, Google Colab is a cloud-based service that's built on top of Google Cloud. It allows us to view, edit, and run Jupyter notebooks without having to perform any kind of local installation. All we really need is a relatively up-to-date web browser. And since the tool is built for running Jupyter notebooks, I'm going to assume that you are either already familiar with Jupyter Notebook or that you've viewed the previous video in which we described Jupyter Notebook. So Google Colab is a free service, but the service is limited. And there's a link here that describes some of those limitations, as well as links to the pro versions, which unfortunately are not free, but they do provide a larger pool of resources that you can use. By default, Google Colab, when creating notebooks, is going to create a Python notebook, or it's going to attach a Python kernel to that notebook. And as far as I'm aware, there's not a nice button somewhere in the interface that allows us to switch from a Python runtime to, say, an R runtime. And to show you what I mean, if I click on File and say New Notebook, this is actually a Python notebook, which means it's running Python in the background, not R. And if I go down to the bottom where it says Change Runtime Type, there's no option to choose another language. Instead, I can choose between what type of hardware acceleration I would like to use, but not the actual language itself. If I switch back to our notebook here, and I click Reconnect, you'll see that it says it's using an IR Google Compute Engine backend. So this notebook is in fact running R. And if we select Change Runtime Type here, now we are given the option of changing the runtime type from R to, say, Python 3. So I don't know why the interface is done this way, but if you don't start with an R notebook,
You don't get to use R natively.
so because of that, I've given you a link here that will automatically create a new R notebook. Feel free to bookmark this for future use. Now, just like in Jupyter Lab or Jupyter Notebook, Google Colab does support both text and code cells, as we would expect. And if we wish to add additional cells to the notebook, we can use one of the two buttons here to add either a code cell or a text cell. These will insert new cells immediately below the currently selected cell. For instance, I can add a new text cell here. The other way to add cells is actually to move your cursor between two cells, and you'll notice that you'll have a little pop-up which gives you the same two buttons for code or text. And this will insert the new cell directly between these two cells. Also, you may have noticed that this toolbar here is relatively sparse. And that's because in Google Colab, they've moved all of the editing functions to a smaller toolbar that appears on the top right corner of your currently selected cell. Now on the toolbar here, we have up and down arrows that allows us to move the currently selected cell throughout the document. We also have a link button that gives you a URL that will not only load this particular notebook, but bring you right to this particular cell. The next button here is actually quite nice if you want to leave yourself or maybe even a collaborator some sort of note or comment. When we click it, you'll see that there's a bubble that appears on the right side. It has my name, the date and time, and I can use this to add comments to the notebook. So if there's perhaps an error that needs to be fixed, I can say fix this and click comment. And this comment bubble will actually remain until it's removed or resolved. So if some later time I come back to the notebook and say I've corrected whatever error was in this cell, I can click resolve. I can click on the three dots to the right and say maybe I want to edit or modify the text in this, or just simply delete the comment. Also, if I select it, I can leave replies. And again, I said if you're working with a collaborator on a document, this can be quite nice. And you can comment on a section and then get feedback from that collaborator through this interface. Now, though, I'm going to delete this comment. For text cells, we have this edit button here, and it can be clicked to open up the Markdown Editor for the cell. For code cells, however, this button is replaced with the Settings button, which opens up the editor's Settings or Preferences pane. If I go back to this text cell and I click the Edit button, this opens up the Markdown Editor, and you can see we're presented with a side-by-side view, the editor on the left-hand side and then a preview pane on the right-hand side. The preview pane will actually give us live updates to any changes we make in the editor on the left. For instance, if I want to make the first sentence bold, I can simply do the following. And we see that the right side is automatically updated. Of course, if I undo this, the change is undone on the right side as well. We can exit edit mode by clicking the Close Editor button. It has replaced our edit button here on the toolbar. Or we can use one of the keyboard shortcuts. Now you can find all the keyboard shortcuts for Colab and Tools, Keyboard Shortcuts. And of course, these can be modified as you like. The next button is the mirror button in the toolbar, and it's actually quite a nice feature. If I click the mirror button here, you'll see that the cell on the left from the notebook is mirrored on the right-hand side in this tabbed view. Now, this is not a copy. Instead, this is a live view of the cell, so any changes I make in the notebook are going to be reflected here and vice versa. Now, with this open, we're free to use the notebook on the left-hand side, editing as we please, and the tabs on the right-hand side will remain visible. This is really quite handy if you have, say, documentation in one part of the notebook, and you need that documentation while you're writing code in others, for instance. The next button here is the delete cell button. This obviously deletes the current cell. And finally, the last button here is a drop-down menu that gives us some additional options like copying and cutting. Now, if we move on to code cells, you'll see the toolbar here is much the same, with the exception of the settings button that we've already commented on. And you'll also notice on the left-hand side, there's this play button. And this play button is actually how we run code cells in Google Colab. We simply click the play button, and the kernel will run the code and return any output to us below. In the text cell just above, you'll see a bulleted list that contains a few shortcut keys that you can also use to run code cells instead of having to press the play button each time. Now, at the end of the notebook here, I've given you a description of all of these items, just in case you'd like to refer back to something. However, before we wrap up this video, I do want to show you one more part of the interface, which is this left bar over here. If we click the first icon in this left bar, you'll see the table of contents appears. Now, this is similar to JupyterLab in that the table of contents is automatically generated from the headers that were used within the text cells in the notebook. Each item here is also a link to the cell containing the header, giving us a very quick way to move throughout the document. The next icon here is the Find and Replace, which gives us a few options for searching and replacing text within the notebook. Next here we have Code Snippets. This is actually a unique feature of Google Colab, as it gives you short segments of code that you can simply copy and paste into your document to perform a variety of tasks, including things like accessing your files from Google Drive.
However, I believe currently all the code snippets in this database are for Python, although hopefully that will change soon to include snippets for other languages like R.
The next icon actually is the file browser. And this gives us access to some sample data that Google provides, as well as the ability to mount your Google Drive so that you can access notebooks or data from there directly.
However, currently Google Colab does not support mounting Google Drive directly here while using an R runtime. It's only supported when using a hosted Python runtime. In the next video on Colab, we're going to discuss a workaround for this, along with a few other items of which you should really be aware.
And with that, this is going to wrap up our description of Google Colab. There are more features to discover, but this should be sufficient to get you going.